My name is Paige Mercer, and I was 25 the night my parents took me to dinner to tell me I was adopted. My mother smiled when she said they'd only kept me for the benefits, and that now I wasn't useful to them anymore. My father slid the paperwork across the tablecloth. They had already filed to cut me out of everything. I didn't cry. I didn't say a single word for almost a minute. But here's what neither of them knew. 6 months before that dinner, I'd found my birth family, and that night I had seated them 3 tables behind my mother's chair. She just hadn't turned around yet. What happened when she finally did is the reason I'm sitting here, 6 years later, telling you any of this. Welcome back to Calm Drama Stories, where we tell quiet, true-to-life family stories about boundaries, dignity, and the moment someone finally stops shrinking to fit a seat they were never offered. If you've ever had to earn your place at your own family's table, this one is for you. Drop a comment below and be sure to subscribe. The restaurant was called Vanterre, and I had never been taken there in my life. My mother chose it. That should have been my first clue, because Diane Mercer did not spend money on me without a reason printed somewhere on the receipt. She wore the gray cashmere she saved for funerals and board meetings. My father, Wesley, had booked the table under her name, not mine, which I noticed when the hostess asked, and he answered before I could. There was no banner, no balloon tied to my chair, no cake waiting in some back kitchen with my name piped in blue. For a birthday dinner, the table was strangely bare, and the air between my parents had the careful politeness of people about to read a verdict. I had spent 4 years sitting in rooms like this. I booked tables like this for clients, for signings, for the quiet conversations families have when somebody dies and the money has to move. I knew the difference between a dinner and a deposition, and this had the temperature of a deposition. So I did what I always do when a room goes cold. I steadied my breathing and I counted the exits. That was when I clocked the small brass number standing on the table behind us and to the left. Table 9. I held it in my mind without quite knowing why, the way you note a landmark before you've decided you'll need to find your way back. I set my own thing down beside my water glass, a thin manila folder, plain and unremarkable. My mother glanced at it and assumed, I think, that it was a resume, or maybe a card. She had no idea what I'd put inside it. You have to understand what birthdays were in our house to understand why I wasn't surprised. When I was small, my birthday was 1 candle. Not 1 candle as a tradition, the way some families do a single tall number. 1 candle, pressed into a grocery store cupcake my mother bought on the way home and never bothered to refrigerate. I'd watch it sweat on the counter while she took a call. Meanwhile, 3 weeks later, my cousin Brett got a rented bounce house and a caterer with little quiches on silver trays, because Brett was my Aunt Renee's son, and Brett was blood. I remember asking, the year I turned 8, if I could have a party too. My aunt was over, drinking my mother's wine, and she answered for her. We can only do one nice thing a month, honey. She said it kindly. That was the part that taught me the most. How kind people can sound while they're explaining your size to you. So I learned the math. 1 cupcake costs less than a party. A child who asks for less is cheaper than a child who asks for the same. By the time I was 9, I had stopped asking for cake, because I could see it made the arithmetic easier for everyone at the table, and being easy felt like the only currency I had. I didn't tell myself it was sad. I told myself it was efficient. That's the thing about growing up useful. You don't notice you've been priced until somebody reads the number out loud. And across that white tablecloth at Vanterre, 25 years old, I could feel my mother getting ready to read it. I left that house the week I turned 18, with 2 duffel bags and a community college acceptance I'd filled out myself. Nobody drove me. I worked nights at a pharmacy counter and took classes in the morning, then transferred to the state school and finished a paralegal program while waiting tables on weekends. I paid for all of it. I want to be clear about that. Not because it makes me special, but because it matters for what came later. Nobody handed me a thing. By 25, I was a paralegal at a trusts and estates firm downtown, and I was good at it. I spent my days inside other people's wealth, organizing what happens to a person's life after they can't hold on to it anymore. I drafted the boring pages that decide everything: beneficiary designations, distribution schedules, the quiet language that controls who eats and who doesn't, long after the funeral flowers wilt. I could read a trust the way some people read a face. And the joke of my life, the one I didn't laugh at for years, was this: I could set a perfect boundary for a total stranger. I could tell a grieving widow exactly what she was owed and exactly what she wasn't. But I could not, for the life of me, ask my own family to want me. The only person I ever called was my grandmother. Every Sunday, 4 o'clock, like clockwork, all through college and after. Nana Ruth. She was the one Mercer who answered the phone like she'd been waiting for it to ring, and it was something Nana once said to me that turned out to be the hinge the whole night swung on. Nana Ruth Mercer was my father's mother, and she was the only adult in that family who ever made me feel like a person instead of a line item. She had opinions about everything and apologies for nothing. When I was 12 and crying in her kitchen because Brett had told me I wasn't a real Mercer, she put down her dish towel, took my chin in her hand, and said the sentence I carried for the next 13 years. You were chosen, sweetheart, not collected. Then she made me a grilled cheese and let me stay up too late. Nana died when I was 23. 2 years before that dinner, I gave the only eulogy that mentioned her by who she was instead of what she left behind. And within a month of the funeral, my parents quietly moved out of their cramped split level and into the larger house on Linden Road, the one that had been in the family for a long time, the one connected to Nana's name in ways I understood better than they realized. I didn't think much of it then. I was grieving. But there was a thing Nana said to me on one of our last Sundays, her voice thin over the phone, that I filed away without understanding. I made sure, she told me, that you'll never have to ask anyone for your own life. I thought she meant it as encouragement, a grandmother telling a granddaughter to be strong. It would be 6 months before that dinner, going through county records for an entirely different reason, that I'd learn she had meant it literally, in writing, and notarized. The year before I turned 25, my family started getting quiet around me, and not the comfortable kind. Texts that used to come back in an hour took 3 days. My mother stopped looping me into the holiday planning chain, then acted surprised when I showed up to Thanksgiving without a side dish nobody had asked me to bring. My Aunt Renee, meanwhile, got louder. She'd started using a word in the family group chat that she'd never bothered with before. Blood. As in, this is a blood-only weekend at the lake. As in, the cabin sleeps 8, and we want to keep it to blood this year. You understand? I did understand. I understood perfectly. I just didn't have the documents yet to know why the temperature had dropped so suddenly, all at once, in the same season. People don't usually turn cold on a schedule. Families drift, sure, but this wasn't drift. This was coordinated, and the analyst part of my brain kept flagging it. The way you notice 3 unrelated invoices arrive on the same Tuesday and realize they aren't unrelated at all. So when my phone lit up one evening in March with my mother's name and a voice 3 degrees warmer than it had been in a year, I didn't feel flattered. I felt the small, cold click of a lock turning somewhere I couldn't see. Honey, she said, and she only called me honey when she wanted something. We'd like to take you out. To celebrate 25 properly, the way we never quite managed. And every instinct I'd built in 4 years of reading other people's bad news told me the same thing. This is too neat. Here is what most people get wrong about my mother. They think the cruelty is loud. It isn't. The cruelty is the planning. The cruelty is a woman who never once managed a birthday cake suddenly reserving a corner table at Vontaire and calling it celebrating you properly. When Diane gets generous, it's because a spreadsheet somewhere has told her the generosity will pay for itself. I'd watched it my whole life. I'd just never been the line item before. So I said yes, sweetly, the way she'd taught me. And then I hung up the phone, and I sat at my kitchen table for a long time, doing what I do. I thought about timelines. I thought about the house on Linden Road. I thought about the word blood showing up in the group chat exactly now, exactly this season, and about a sentence my grandmother had said to me before she died. and I thought about the manila folder already sitting in my work bag, the one I'd assembled 6 months earlier for reasons that had nothing to do with my mother and everything to do with finally knowing where I came from. I didn't call my parents back to ask questions. I didn't warn them I'd been to the county clerk. Instead, I made a few calls of my own. Quiet ones. The kind you make when you've decided you're not going to be ambushed, you're going to be ready. I won't tell you yet who I called. But I'll tell you the rule I live by. The one Nana never said out loud but taught me anyway. When my mother is sweet, someone at the table is about to lose something. I just made sure, this time, it wouldn't be me. People assume a story like this is about money, and I understand why. There's a will somewhere. A house. A folder slid across a table. But sitting in my car in the Vanterre parking lot that night, engine off, hands steady on the wheel, the thing I was afraid of losing had no dollar amount. I was afraid of losing the last idea that I had ever belonged anywhere. Because as cold as that house had been, as transactional as every candle and every casserole, it was still the only origin story I had. They were still, technically, my parents. And if they cut that thread tonight, the way I suspected they'd come to cut it, then I would be exactly what Brett had called me at 12. Not a real Mercer. Just a girl somebody picked up and put down. That's the wound they were aiming for, and they knew it, because it's the wound they'd been pressing on my whole life. What they didn't account for was that the wound had already closed. 6 months can do that, if the right people find you. I checked my reflection in the visor mirror, tucked the folder under my arm, and walked across that lot with the particular calm of a woman who has read the last page of a book everyone else thinks is still being written. I wasn't going to a disownment. I was going to a goodbye I'd already chosen. They just didn't know it yet. We ordered drinks before anyone said a true thing. My mother praised the wine list. My father told a story about parking he'd already told in the car. And then, somewhere between the bread and the entrees nobody would end up eating, Diane folded her hands and shifted into the voice. I know that voice. It's the one she used when she returned a Christmas gift in front of me and explained why it hadn't been practical. We've always done our very best for you, she began. Wesley nodded along, a half-second behind, the way he'd nodded behind her for 30 years. We gave you a roof, an education. More than some children ever get. I let her talk. I rested one hand flat on the manila folder beside my plate, and I watched my father's eyes flick down to it and away. The folder had a label on the tab, typed, just the top edge showing above my fingers. He could see 4 letters of it if he looked, and he looked. T-R-U-S. I covered the rest with my thumb, not to hide it, just to let him wonder, and I watched the wondering start to work on him. My mother kept going about sacrifices, about how a child should understand the cost of being raised, and I thought about a sweating cupcake and 1 candle, and I said nothing. Then she paused, took a small sip, set the glass down with the precision of a woman reaching a slide she'd practiced, and said the line that opened the door to everything. There's something, Paige, that you should have been told a very long time ago. You're adopted, my mother said. She said it the way you'd announce a change to a dinner reservation. We adopted you when you were an infant. You were never biologically ours. I want you to know we never planned to keep this from you forever. She watched my face while she said it, and I understood that she was waiting for the collapse. This was the moment she'd built the whole evening around, the corner table and the cashmere and the practiced pauses, all of it engineered to land right here, on the second when her adopted daughter learned she'd been a stranger all along, and broke into pieces she could sweep up and walk away from. I'd love to tell you it didn't land. It landed. Some part of a person always braces for the floor to be there, and mine had just been told there was no floor. But I'd had 6 months to learn this already, and the only thing my mother actually revealed that night was how little she knew about me. She leaned in, almost gentle, and delivered the sentence I will hear in waiting rooms and quiet kitchens for the rest of my life. We only kept you for the benefits. She smiled when she said it. That was the detail that freed me, in the end. Not the cruelty. I'd been raised on the cruelty. The smile. A woman does not smile delivering the worst news of your life unless she has rehearsed it enough times to enjoy the choreography. And in her smile, I finally saw the whole shape of it. I hadn't been a daughter who disappointed them. I'd been an asset that had finished depreciating. Benefits is a clean word for a dirty arrangement, and my father, to his discredit, tried to explain it like an accountant defending a tax position. There were assistance payments in the early years, Wesley said, not meeting my eyes. The adoption came with a small monthly subsidy when you were little, but that ran out a long time ago, when you were still in grade school. There were tax considerations after that. And there was your grandmother, of course, though he didn't say her name like that. He said Nana had certain expectations about family, that adopting you had helped them meet those expectations, and that meeting them had turned out to be, in his careful accountant's word, worthwhile, for a good many years. I sat very still, and let the arithmetic of my childhood rearrange itself into its true equation. The one cupcake. The hand-me-downs from Brett that came with the tags from Renee's returns still on them. The way the heat got turned down in my room first. They hadn't been poor. They'd been pocketing the difference between what a child costs and what a child generates. And I had been the generator. We invested in you, Wesley said, as if that settled it. As if a child were a rental property with a depreciation curve. And then my mother, impatient with his bookkeeping, cut to the line underneath all the others, the one the whole evening had been built to deliver. The subsidy's been gone since you were a child, Paige, and what came after it ends today. You're 25 now. There's simply nothing further that keeping you up does for us. She said it almost regretfully, the way you'd note that a coupon had expired. Now you're not useful. 2 sentences, and they'd reduced a quarter-century of being their daughter to a line that had stopped producing income. I reached for my water. My hand did not shake. I noticed that it didn't, and I filed it away as a small, surprising gift. Then my father did the thing he'd come to do. He reached into the leather portfolio he'd brought, the one I'd assumed held a birthday card, and slid a thin sheaf of papers across the tablecloth until it touched my plate. We've already filed, he said, to formalize things. You won't be in the will. You won't be a beneficiary on anything of ours. We wanted to do this cleanly, in person, so there'd be no confusion later. He'd rehearsed cleanly. I could hear the lawyer who'd coached him in it. And here is the part I have never been able to make my family understand, the part that turned the whole night for me without my saying a word. I read the caption on the first page in about 4 seconds, the way I'd read 1,000 of them, and I saw immediately what they had done. They had filed against the wrong instrument. They'd spent good money cutting me out of an estate that was almost beside the point, while leaving entirely untouched the document that actually decided everything. They didn't know what I knew. They thought the power in this room ran through their own modest will, and so that's where they'd aimed their expensive little knife. I didn't correct them. You don't tell the other side they've sued the wrong defendant. You let them finish. So I slid the papers an inch back toward the center of the table, neither accepting nor refusing, and I let them keep believing they'd won. Across the table, my Aunt Renee's voice arrived on speakerphone from my mother's purse because of course Renee was listening, because Renee had been the architect of half of this. Blood looks after blood, Paige, she said, warm as a knife in soup. You've always understood that. I didn't cry. I want to be honest that part of me had expected to, that some 12-year-old still living in my chest had been braced for this exact table since the night Brett told her she wasn't real. But 25-year-old me just took a slow sip of water and set the glass down without a sound, and I watched something cross my mother's face that I had genuinely never seen there before. Disappointment. Not at me. At the performance. She'd written this scene with a sobbing girl in the lead, and the girl wasn't sobbing, and it was ruining her ending. Aren't you going to say anything? She asked, and there was an edge in it now, the brittleness of a woman whose script has gone off the rails. I considered the question. I considered everything I could have said, the whole flood of it, 25 years backed up behind one small dam. And then she made the mistake people like her always make. She filled the silence by reaching for the line that had worked the first time, expecting it to work again. "We only kept you for the benefits," she repeated, slower this time, leaning on each word, trying to draw blood she could see. But a sentence loses its teeth the second time you hear it from the same mouth. The first time, it had been a revelation. The second time, it was just a confession, and not about me. It told me everything about her, and nothing about my worth. I set my napkin in my lap, smoothed it once, and let her watch me not break. Behind her, at table 9, I saw a woman with my exact chin turn her head toward our table and go still. To explain what was in my folder, I have to take you back 6 months, to the week 2 envelopes arrived and changed the arithmetic of my entire life, the first I'd been waiting for. After Nana died, I'd finally registered with the State Adoption Reunion Registry, half certain nothing would come of it. 8 weeks later, a letter arrived in handwriting I didn't recognize, careful and looping, the hand of a woman who'd practiced what she wanted to say. It was from Susan Hale. She wrote that she had been 19 when she gave me up, that she had not wanted to, that she had thought about me every March for 25 years, and that if I ever wanted to meet her, she would drive any distance, any day, no expectations. She'd signed it, and then under her name she'd written one more line, the one I read so many times, the paper went soft. "I never stopped saving you a seat." The second envelope came 3 days later, and it had nothing to do with Susan. Or so I thought. Our state had only recently opened original birth records to adult adoptees, available once you turned 21 and filed through the same reunion registry, and I'd put in my request the week Susan's letter arrived. While I was in the county system waiting on mine, I requested the file on Nana's estate, professional habit, the way a dentist looks at strangers' teeth. And there it was, in the distribution schedule of the Ruth Mercer Family Trust, executed 2 years before her death, administered not by my parents, but by a bank. "The caregiver distributions to Wesley and Diane Mercer," it read, "shall terminate upon the beneficiary's 25th birthday, whereupon the remainder shall pass to my granddaughter, Paige, not their estate, hers. Held by a trustee they couldn't touch, scheduled to leave their hands forever on the exact date they'd chosen for that dinner." 2 envelopes in 1 week. One told me where I'd come from. The other told me, in my grandmother's notarized hand, exactly what my parents were about to lose, and why they were suddenly in such a hurry. I did not call my mother and scream the discovery down the phone. That's not the weapon I had, and it's not the weapon I trust. I've watched too many families lose everything to a satisfying outburst that a lawyer later turns into evidence. What I had was process, so I used process. I took a personal day, drove the trust documents to an estate's attorney with no connection to my family, and paid her out of my own savings to confirm what I already suspected. The caregiver distributions were legitimate, ongoing, and ending. My parents had been drawing a monthly sum for raising me and living in the house the trust funded for the better part of 2 decades. The remainder, on my 25th birthday, passed to me by the trust's own terms through a corporate trustee, with nothing my parents could file, sign, or shred to stop it. Their will was irrelevant to it. Their disownment was theater performed on the wrong stage. My attorney asked if I wanted to notify them, get ahead of it, soften the landing. I said no. I said I wanted 3 things in a folder, and that was all. The retainer letter, so they'd know I had counsel. The trust's distribution schedule, so they'd see the date in black and white. And my original birth certificate, with Susan Hale's name in the mother's line, so that when the moment came, the table would understand exactly which family I was choosing to leave and which one I was choosing to keep. I labeled the tab, and I closed the folder, and I put it in my bag, and I carried it for 6 months like a quiet engine I hadn't turned on yet. The dinner invitation only told me when to turn the key. I met Susan Hale for the first time in a diner halfway between our cities, because she didn't want me to have to drive too far, and that small consideration undid me more than any speech could have. She was nervous. She'd brought a photo album she kept opening and closing without showing me, like she wasn't sure she'd earned the right. She had my chin and my way of going quiet when she felt too much. Over 6 months, we built something carefully, the way you'd repair a bridge while standing on it. I learned I had a half-brother named Danny, 20, all elbows and questions, who texted me memes within a week of meeting me as if I'd always been there to receive them. I learned my birth grandmother was a small, ferocious woman named Pearl, who took one look at me and said, "Well, there she is." Like I'd just been late, not gone for a quarter century. They never asked me for anything. That was the part my whole nervous system couldn't parse. No favors, no money, no role to perform. Susan told me, the third time we met, the thing that would become the truest line of my life. "We've kept a seat for you, sweetheart," she said. "We never gave it to anyone else." And I, who could draft a flawless beneficiary clause for a stranger, who knew the precise legal language of belonging, sat in a vinyl booth and did not know what to do with my own hands, because I had been wanted, for the first time, by people who got nothing out of wanting me. After 25 years of being useful, I had no idea how to simply be welcome. I was about to have to learn fast. There's a difference between being needed and being wanted, and I'd only ever known one of them. Being needed, I understood completely. Being needed is a job. You show up, you produce, you stay easy, you keep the math simple, and in exchange, you get to keep your seat another quarter. I had been needed my whole life, and I'd mistaken the steadiness of it for love, the way you can mistake a long commute for a destination just because you do it every day. What Susan and Danny and Pearl offered me had no job attached, and that terrified me more than my mother ever had. The first time Susan called just to ask how my week was, with no agenda underneath it, I waited the whole conversation for the catch, and when there wasn't one, I had to pull my car over because I couldn't see the road. I kept testing them, in small, ungenerous ways I'm not proud of. I'd cancel a plan to see if they'd punish me. They didn't. They just said, "No worries, next time," and meant it. I'd offer to pay for everything, to make myself useful, to earn the seat. Pearl finally took my face in her hands the way Nana used to and said, "You don't have to buy your way in here. We already paid." And slowly, over those 6 months, a knot I'd carried since I was 9 began, not to vanish, but to loosen. I started to believe, against 25 years of evidence, that a person could simply want me in the room. So when my mother called to invite me to celebrate 25 properly, I already knew where I wanted to spend the evening. I just decided to spend it everywhere at once. Here's who I called. The night my mother booked Vanterre, I called Susan, and I asked her a question I'd been too afraid to ask anyone in my life. "Would you come to my birthday dinner?" I explained the whole shape of it, the parents, the suspicions, the trust, the speech I could feel coming. I told her I didn't know exactly what they planned to say, but I knew I didn't want to hear it alone, and I knew I no longer wanted to perform the grief they were counting on. Susan didn't hesitate for even a second. She said, "What time? And where? And should we dress up?" Then she said something that made me put my hand over my mouth in my kitchen. "We'd be honored," she said, "to watch you not need them." So I made one more call, this one to Vanterre, and I booked a second table for that same evening under my own name, Paige Mercer, party of 3. Table 9, the host told me, near the back, 3 tables behind the reservation already on the books for a Mercer party of 3 at the front. I almost laughed at the geometry of it. They had no idea they'd be performing my disownment within sight of the family that had spent 25 years saving me a chair. I told Susan and Pearl and Danny to arrive a little after us, to order quietly, to simply be there, and to let me come to them when I was ready. I won't pretend I didn't want them in that room. I did. There's a reason the truth lands harder spoken in front of people than mailed in a letter, and I'd watched enough confrontations to know a private one only ever becomes the other side's word against yours. So yes, I wanted witnesses, and I'm not ashamed of it. But Susan and Pearl and Danny were never just witnesses to me, and that was the whole difference between what they were doing and what my mother was doing. The folder was how I'd make my parents understand they'd lost. Table 9 was where I'd go to remember I'd won long before they sat down. Back at the front table, in the present, my mother decided the silence had gone on long enough and moved to close the deal. She produced one more page from the leather portfolio and turned it to face me, uncapping a pen and setting it across the paper like a small gift. "It's just an acknowledgement," she said, "that we've informed you, that you understand the situation. Sign it, and we can all have a civilized dinner and go our separate ways." I looked at the page and I didn't have to read far. The release paragraph opened with the exact boilerplate I'd typed 100 times myself. "The undersigned hereby waives and forever releases any claim, interest, or expectancy." And the rest of it did what that language always does. It wasn't an acknowledgement. It was a waiver wearing one, a tidy little document designed to have me agree on the record that I'd been notified and had no claim. The kind of thing a careful lawyer drafts to head off exactly the challenge I was in a position to bring. They wanted my signature while I was still bleeding from the reveal, before the shock wore off, and I could think. It's a classic move. I've seen grieving people sign away fortunes at kitchen tables because someone slid the pen over at the right wounded moment. My mother was counting on my wound. She didn't know it had a trust attached to it. I left the pen where it lay. My father, across from me, kept glancing at my manila folder, and I watched the worry climb up his neck in a slow red tide. Wesley had always been the one who knew where the money actually lived. He'd seen the 4 letters on the tab. He was doing the arithmetic now, the same arithmetic I'd done 6 months before, and I could tell the answer was beginning to scare him. "Is there?" he started, then stopped. "Is there something we should know, Paige?" I smiled at him, the first real smile of the night. "Not yet," I said. That was when my Aunt Renee arrived in person, with Brett trailing behind her, both of them feigning the surprise of people who'd been waiting in the bar for a text. "Paige, what a coincidence," Renee said, pressing a cold cheek to mine, and I understood instantly that Diane had summoned reinforcements. My mother liked an audience for her best work, and she especially liked one that would nod along and apply pressure if I got difficult. Renee pulled up a chair without being asked. Brett, 26 and still dressing like his mother bought his clothes, gave me a look I'd been getting since we were children, the look that said you were always going to end up at the kids' table eventually. Renee got right to it, because subtlety was never her instrument. "We just want what's best for the family," she said, laying a manicured hand over my mother's. "And families have to make hard choices about who's really part of them. You've always been such a practical girl, Paige. You understand that blood looks after blood." There it was again, that word, the one she'd been seeding in the group chat all year, finally said out loud at the table it had been built for. I looked at my aunt, who had answered for my mother the day I turned 8 and explained to a child why she wasn't worth a party, and I felt the last thread of obligation in me go slack. These were not people I was losing. These were people I was setting down. I'd carried them a long way, longer than they deserved, and my arms were finally, gloriously tired. Across the table, my father wasn't joining in. He was staring at his hands. And then, while Renee was mid-sentence about the family's wishes, Wesley leaned toward me and said something low, just for me. "Your grandmother loved you," my father said, very quietly under Renee's chatter. He stopped there. For a moment I saw the whole other version of Wesley Mercer, the one who might have existed if he'd ever once chosen a harder thing over a comfortable one. His eyes were wet. He'd loved his mother. I knew that much was true, and some part of him understood that the woman he'd loved had built a wall around me with her own money precisely because she didn't trust her son to protect me. That had to be a terrible thing to sit with at a dinner table. I waited. I genuinely waited, because there was a version of that night where my father said the next sentence, the apology, the "I'm sorry, this is wrong, I won't do this," and I would have heard it, and it would have mattered. But he looked at my mother, who was watching him the way a handler watches a dog that's wandered toward the road, and I saw him choose. He sat back. He picked up his water. And the almost sentence died in his throat where so many of his almost sentences had died over the years. That was the closest thing to love anyone at the front table offered me all night, and it lasted 4 words and a swallow. I didn't hate him for it. You can't hate a man for being exactly the weight you always knew he was. But I understood finally that the reason they'd filed in such a hurry, the reason for the whole rushed cruel evening, was sitting behind his wet eyes. He knew about Nana's trust. He'd known the date was coming, and he had hoped, desperately, to get my signature on a waiver before I ever found out what his mother had done for me. So I asked him a question, not loudly, not as a daughter. I asked it in the voice I use at the firm when I've found the flaw in someone's filing and I'm giving them the dignity of noticing it themselves. Dad, I said, which instrument did you file under? Your estate? Or Nana's trust? The table went quiet in a new way. My mother's wineglass paused on its way to her mouth. Renee's manicured hand stopped patting. Wesley blinked at me like I'd started speaking a language he half recognized from a country he'd never visited. Because in 8 words I'd told them 3 things they hadn't budgeted for. That I knew there was a difference between the two. That I knew which one mattered. And that I'd known long enough to learn the vocabulary cold. My mother had never heard me use that voice before. None of them had. To them, I'd always been the quiet one, the easy one, the girl who took the smaller slice so the table could stay pleasant. They had built this entire evening on the assumption that I would receive my fate, not audit it. What? My mother said, and it came out smaller than she meant it to. What are you talking about? I let the question sit. I've learned that the most powerful thing in any room is the person who doesn't need to rush to the answer. I turned my water glass a quarter turn on the cloth, lined it up with the edge of the manila folder, and I looked at my father, who had gone very pale, and who already knew, and who was silently begging me with his eyes not to open it. Then I opened it. I didn't make a show of it. There was no flourish, no slammed document, no speech. I simply turned the folder so it faced them, and I laid the 3 pages out on the white cloth, side by side, the way I'd lay exhibits in front of a client who needed to understand their own situation. The retainer letter, first, with the firm's letterhead and the unmistakable line confirming that I was represented by counsel. The distribution schedule of the Ruth Mercer Family Trust, second, with the relevant paragraph already there in black and white for anyone at the table to read. And third, my original birth certificate, with Susan Hale's name where my mother had assumed her own name belonged. I didn't point at anything. I let the paper do the work paper does. My mother's eyes went to the trust schedule first, because of course they did, because some animal part of her had always known where the money slept. I watched her read it. I watched the words go in. The caregiver distributions to Wesley and Diane Mercer shall terminate upon the beneficiary's 25th birthday, whereupon the remainder shall pass to my granddaughter, Paige. I watched her reach the word remainder, and the word Paige, and I watched the color leave her face from the top down, like a window shade being drawn. She looked up at me, and then at Wesley, and then back at the page, the way people do when they're hoping the second reading will say something kinder than the first. It didn't. It never does. Mom, I said, gently, because I could afford to be gentle now. You filed against the wrong family. The one you cut me out of was always the smaller one. My mother is a fast woman, and I'll give her that, even now. It took her about 10 seconds to assemble the full picture, and I watched her do it in real time. The house on Linden Road, funded by the trust, that she'd assumed she'd live in forever. The monthly distributions that had quietly furnished her comfortable life, and that stopped, by their own terms, tonight. The remainder, the real money, the part she'd spent 2 decades adjacent to and never controlling, passing on this exact date to the daughter she'd just told she was finished with. And the waiver, her clever little waiver, that I'd been seconds from signing, that would have been worth precisely nothing because it released a claim on an estate that was never where the value lived. She had aimed every weapon she owned at a will and missed the trust entirely. The cruelty had been free. The mistake had been expensive. And here is where I learned the last thing my mother had to teach me, which is that people like her never apologize at the moment they're caught. They pivot. Her face rearranged itself, the cold draining out and a terrible warmth flooding in, and she reached across the table for my hand. Paige, she said, and her voice had gone soft and wet and maternal in a way it had never once been when it cost her anything. "We're still your parents. Whatever's in those papers, that doesn't change what we are. We're family." The word family, from the mouth that 20 minutes earlier had said we only kept you for the benefits. I looked at her hand reaching for mine, and I did not take it. The same sentence that had been her weapon was now, in this light, the confession that cleared me to leave. People expect this is the part where I made them pay, where I detailed exactly what the remainder was worth, watched them squirm, maybe ordered the most expensive thing on the menu and left them the bill. I understand the appetite for it. I've felt it. But I want to tell you the truth about power, because I handle it for a living. The strongest position in any room isn't the one holding the biggest number. It's the one that doesn't need the number at all. I had a career I'd built with my own hands. I had savings I'd earned waiting tables and drafting documents. I did not need Nana's remainder to be free, and that, more than any dollar figure, was what my mother could not survive understanding. So I closed the folder. I gathered the 3 pages back into it, unhurried, and I capped the pen they'd brought for my surrender and set it neatly beside her plate. I'd won the thing they thought we were fighting over before any of them sat down, and I'd won it by knowing, by preparing, by refusing to be ambushed. There was nothing left to argue. There was only the choice of where to spend the rest of my birthday. And I'd made that choice 6 months ago, in a vinyl diner booth, when a nervous woman with my chin slid a photo album across a table and didn't ask me for a single thing. I administer estates for a living, and I'll tell you what I tell every client who's being circled by people who only appear when there's something to gain. If someone in your life shows up only when you're useful, you already know what that is. And no amount of shared history makes it love. Type the word boundaries below if you've had to learn that the hard way. And subscribe, because the part you came for is about to happen. I stood up. I did it the way you'd rise from any table. No drama, just a woman pushing her chair back and reaching for her folder. But the effect on the front table was immediate. My mother's hand was still hanging in the air where mine should have been. "Sit down," she said, and the soft maternal mask slipped, and the old cold control snapped back into her voice like a bone setting. "Sit down, Paige. Where on earth do you think you're going?" Renee straightened. Brett, for once, stopped smirking. My father just looked tired, the look of a man watching the only good thing his mother ever did walk out of his reach forever. I picked up the folder and held it against my chest, and I looked at my mother, who had spent 25 years and an expensive dinner trying to make me understand that I had no real place anywhere, and I told her where I was going in the plainest words I owned. "My birth family is sitting 3 tables behind you." I didn't say it cruelly. I didn't need to. The sentence had been true for the entire meal, true while she smiled and rehearsed and slid her waiver across the cloth. True the whole time she believed she was performing my disownment to an audience of strangers. She hadn't been performing it to strangers. She'd been performing it within arm's reach of the people who'd been saving me a chair since before she ever decided I'd stopped being useful. And I watched my words travel across the table and land, and I watched my mother begin, very slowly, to turn around in her seat. My mother turned around slowly, the way you turn when some part of you already knows and is begging the rest of you to be wrong. The cashmere shoulders rotated, her chin came around, and there, at table 9, 3 tables back beneath the warm, low light, were Susan and Pearl and Danny, who had been there the entire time, who had ordered quietly and eaten almost nothing, who had watched my mother deliver the worst sentences of my life, and had kept their seats and their composure because I'd asked them to let me come to them. Susan met my mother's eyes first. She didn't glare. She didn't gloat. She just looked at the woman who had raised her daughter on 1 candle and a calculator, and then she looked at me, and her whole face opened like a window in spring. Pearl, small and ferocious, had her napkin already folded by her plate, ready. Danny had stopped pretending to look at his phone. My mother's gaze went from Susan's chin to mine and back again, doing the resemblance math, and I saw the exact moment she understood that the family she'd just told me I didn't have was sitting 15 feet behind her in real chairs at a real table, having watched her do the one thing she could never take back in front of witnesses she didn't know she had. She turned back to me, and her mouth opened, and nothing came out. For the first time in my entire life, my mother had no script. And in the silence where her next cruel line should have been, a chair scraped back at table 9. They stood up, all three of them, not to make a scene, not to confront anyone, just to be on their feet when I crossed the room to them, the way you stand for someone arriving at a gate after a long flight. Pearl stood first, because Pearl does everything first, and then Susan, and then Danny, knocking his knee on the table leg in his hurry. They didn't say a word to my parents. They didn't have to. Their standing said the entire thing. The restaurant had gone quiet around us, the particular hush of strangers who can feel that something true is happening and have stopped pretending not to watch. A waiter froze with a tray, and I walked. Past my mother, who was still turned half around in her chair. Past Renee, whose mouth had finally run out of the word blood. Past my father, who lifted his eyes to me as I passed, and then dropped them again, choosing comfort one last time. 15 feet, 3 tables, 25 years. When I read them, Pearl took my face in both her hands the way Nana used to, and Susan pulled out the empty chair beside her own, the 4th chair, the one they'd asked the host to set even though their reservation was for 3. And she said the words she'd written under her name in that first letter, the words that had gone soft from my reading them. "We saved you a seat," she said. "We always did." And I sat down in the seat that had been waiting my whole life, at the table that had wanted me before they knew if I'd ever come. That was when my mother lost the one thing she'd never lost in front of people: her composure. I heard her chair scrape, heard her stand, heard the front table calm she'd worn all evening crack straight down the middle. "After everything we paid for," she said, and it wasn't quiet anymore, it carried across the dining room, sharp and rising. "After everything we did for you, the schools, the roof, the years, you do this to us, in public. You humiliate your family over money." Heads turned now, openly. A man at the bar set down his drink. Renee was tugging at my mother's sleeve, hissing, "Diane, sit down, people are looking." But my mother was past the reach of her own handler for the first time in her life, because the script was gone, and all she had left was the truth coming out sideways. "We gave you everything," she said, to a room full of strangers, and I noticed she said gave, not loved. Even now, even cornered, the word love would not come because it had never been in the inventory. I stayed in my seat at table 9. I didn't stand to match her. I didn't raise my voice to meet hers. Susan's hand had found mine under the table, and I just held it and let my mother be loud, because the loudness was doing my work for me. Every person in that restaurant was watching a calm young woman seated quietly with people who clearly adored her, and a furious older woman shouting about everything she'd paid for. And there is not a human being alive who hears a parent screaming about money and thinks, "Ah, there's the real family." My father never stood at all. He just put his face in his hands. I let her run out of words, the way a storm runs out of rain, and when the quiet came back, I did one last thing before I gave her the rest of my attention to my actual family. I stood, walked the 3 tables back to the front, and set a single page down on the white cloth in front of her. The trust's distribution schedule. I left it face up. I didn't need it anymore. My attorney had the originals, and I wanted my mother to have something to read on the longest evening of her life. "You can keep this one," I said. "You'll want to understand what ended today and what didn't." She stared at the page. Wesley reached for it, and then didn't. And I looked at the two of them, my mother who had priced me at 1 candle, and my father who had loved his own mother too much to honor what she'd asked of him, and I said the only sentence I'd prepared in advance, the one I'd written in my head in the parking lot, and decided I'd only use if I earned it. "You kept me for the benefits," I said. "They kept a seat for me." Then I turned around and I walked back to table 9, and I did not look behind me again. Not once. Not when Renee called my name. Not when my mother said something I couldn't hear and didn't want to. I sat back down beside Susan. Pearl had ordered me a slice of the chocolate cake while I was gone, and Danny had stuck the little restaurant candle in it, a single candle, lit. And for 1 second the symmetry of it caught in my throat. Then Susan leaned over and said, "Blow it out, sweetheart, make the wish," and I realized I didn't have one. I already had it. The trust did exactly what my grandmother built it to do. On my 25th birthday, the caregiver distributions to Wesley and Diane Mercer ended, on the date, and by the terms Nana had notarized 2 years before she died. The remainder passed to me through the bank trustee, untouched by the will my parents had spent good money revising, because you cannot disinherit someone from a trust you don't control. Their waiver, unsigned, was worth what it was always worth. Within a year, my parents sold the house on Linden Road, because without the distributions they couldn't carry it, and moved into something smaller, and I am told Renee was furious to learn that none of Nana's money would be flowing toward Brett after all. The story of that dinner traveled, the way these stories do, through the family and then past it, and the version where Diane Mercer is the devoted mother, wronged by an ungrateful adopted daughter, never quite took, because too many strangers at Vontaire had watched a woman scream about everything she'd paid for while a quiet girl held hands with the family across the room. I didn't sue anyone. I didn't post anything. I simply stopped answering, and I let the silence be the boundary, which is the only kind that ever holds. My father texted me once, a few weeks later. 3 words. "I am sorry." No name signed, no follow-up when I didn't reply. I never replied. I heard later that when Renee tried to rally the family to contest Nana's trust, it was Wesley who quietly shut it down, told them their mother had every right to leave her money where she pleased, that it was hers, that it was finished. He was right. He was also, as ever, a year too late and saying it to the wrong room, when it cost him nothing and changed nothing. That was the whole of my father in the end. A man who knew the right thing, even felt it, and could only ever bring himself to do it once doing it had stopped requiring anything of him. I didn't need the apology, but I was glad.